Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 16 of our reading of George Orwell's 1984. First of all, we are going to go over the copyright information, and it appears that Hate Week is in full swing, so both Winston and Julia are extra busy with their jobs, so they haven't been able to get together. And so I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll find out. Anyways, it says that the story itself is copyright 1949, hence 1984. Afterward is copyright 1961. Anyway, it says all rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or portions thereof in any form. So, that being said, we will dive right in. I will, of course, say that there are some things that probably happened in this book that I don't exactly agree with or that conflict with my worldview, but it is still a very good story, and I will read it. Basically, there's a bunch of excitement over Hate Week and stuff like that. That's basically the gist of the last one. In the room over Mr. Charrington's shop, when they could get there, Julie and Winston lay side by side on a stripped bed under the open window, naked for the sake of coolness. The rat had never come back, but the bugs had multiplied hideously in the heat. It did not seem to matter. Dirty or clean, the room was paradise. As soon as they arrived, they would sprinkle everything with pepper bought on the black market, tear off their clothes and make love with sweating bodies, then fall asleep and wake to find that the bugs had rallied and were massing for the counterattack. 4, 5, 6, 7 times they met during the month of June. Winston had dropped his habit of drinking gin at all hours. He seemed to have lost the need for it. He had grown fatter. His varicose ulcer had subsided, leaving only a brown stain on the skin above his ankle. His fits of coughing in the early morning had stopped. The process of life had ceased to be intolerable. He had no longer any impulse to make faces at the telescreen or shout curses at the top of his voice. Now that they had a secure hiding place, almost a home, it didn't even seem a hardship that they could only meet infrequently and for a couple of hours at a time. What mattered was that the room over the junk shop could exist. To know that it was there, inviolate, was almost the same as being in it. The room was a world, a pocket of the past where extinct animals could walk. Mr. Charrington thought Winston was another extinct animal. He usually stopped to talk with Mr. Charrington for a few minutes on his way upstairs. The old man seemed seldom or never to go out of doors, and on the other hand, to have almost no customers. He led a ghost-like existence between the tiny, dark shop and an even tinier back kitchen, where he prepared his meals, and which contained, among other things, an unbelievably ancient gramophone with an enormous horn. He seemed glad of the opportunity to talk, wandering about among his worthless stock with his long nose and thick spectacles, and his bowed shoulders. In the velvet jacket. He had always vaguely an air of being a collector rather than the tradesman. With a sort of faded enthusiasm, he would finger this scrap of rubbish or that, a china bottle stopper, the painted lid of a broken snuff box, a pinchbeck locket containing a strand of some long-dead baby's hair, never asking that Winston should buy it, merely that he should admire it. To talk to him was like listening to the tinkling of a worn-out music box. He had dragged out from the corners of his memory some more fragments of forgotten rhymes. There was one about 4 and 20 blackbirds, and another about a cow with a crumpled horn, and another about the death of poor Cock Robin. It had occurred to me you might be interested, he would say with a depreciating little laugh whenever he produced a new fragment, but he could never recall more than a few lines of any one rhyme. Both of them knew, in a way, it was never out of their minds that what was now happening could not last long. There were times when the fact of impending death seemed as palpable as the bed they lay on, and they would cling together with a sort of despairing sensuality, like a condemned soul grasping for his last morsel of pleasure, when the clock was within 5 minutes of striking. But there were also times when they had the illusion not only of safety, but of permanence. So long as they were actually in the room, they both felt no harm could come to them. Getting there was difficult and dangerous, but the room itself was sanctuary. It was as when Winston had gazed into the heart of the paperweight, with the feeling that it would be possible to get inside that glassy world, and excuse me, and that once inside, time could be arrested. Often they gave themselves up to daydreams of escape. Their luck would hold indefinitely, and they would carry on their intrigue just like this for the remainder of their natural lives. Or Catherine would die and by subtle maneuvering, Winston and Julia would succeed in getting married, or they would commit suicide together, or they would disappear, alter themselves out of recognition, learn to speak with Prolian accents, get jobs in a factory, and live out their lives undetected in a back street. It was all nonsense, as they both knew. In reality, there was no escape, even the one plan that was practical, suicide. They had no intention of carrying out. To hang on from day to day and from week to week, spinning out a present that had no future, seemed an unconquerable instinct, just as one's lungs will always draw the next breath, so long as there is air available. Sometimes, too, they talked of engaging in active rebellion against the party, but with no notion of how to take the first step. Even if the fabulous brotherhood was a reality, there was still remained the difficulty of finding one's way into it. He told her of the strange intimacy that existed or seemed to exist between himself and O'Brien, and of the impulse he sometimes felt simply by walking into O'Brien's presence, announced that he was the enemy of the party and demand his help. Curiously enough, this did not strike her as an impossibly rash thing to do. She was used to judging people by their faces, and it seemed natural to her that Winston should believe O'Brien to be trustworthy on the strength of a single flash of the eyes. Moreover, she took it for granted that everyone, or nearly everyone, secretly hated the party and would break the rules if he thought it safe to do so. But she refused to believe that widespread organized oppression existed or could exist. The tales about Goldstein and the underground army, she said, were simply a lot of rubbish which the party had invented for its own purposes and which you had to pretend to believe in. Times beyond number, at party rallies, the spontaneous demonstrations she had shouted at the top of her voice for the execution of people whose names she had never heard, and in whose supposed crimes she had not the faintest belief. When the public trials were happening, she had taken her place in the detachments from the youth league who surrounded the courts from morning to night, chanting at intervals, "Death to the traitors." During the 2 minutes hate, she always excelled all others in shouting insults at Goldstein. Yet she had only the dimmest idea of what Goldstein was and what doctrines he was supposed to represent. She had grown up since the rebellion and was too young to remember the ideological battles of the 50s and 60s. Such a thing as the independent political movement was outside her imagination. And in any case, the party was invincible. It would always exist, and it would always be the same. You you could not rebel against it by secret disobedience or, at most, by isolated acts of violence, such as killing somebody or blowing something up. Oh, yeah, you could only rebel against it by doing those things. Okay, again, okay. In some ways, she was far more acute than Winston and far less susceptible to party propaganda. Once, when he happened in some connection to mention the war against Eurasia, she startled him by saying casually that, in her opinion, the war was not happening. The rocket bombs, which fell daily on London, were probably fired by the government of Oceania itself, just to keep the people frightened. This was an idea that had literally never occurred to him. She also stirred a sort of envy in him by telling him that during the 2 minutes' hate, her great difficulty avoid bursting out laughing, but she only questioned the teachings of the party when they were in some way touched upon her own life. Often she was ready to accept the official mythology, simply because the difference between truth and falsehood did not seem important to her. She believed, for instance, having learned it in school, that the party had invented airplanes. In his own school days, Winston remembered that in the late 50s, it was only the helicopter that the party claimed to have invented. A dozen years later, when Julia was in school, it had already claimed the airplane. One generation more, and it would be claiming the steam engine. And when he told her that airplanes had been in existence before he was born, excuse me, and long before the Revolution, the fact struck her as totally uninteresting. After all, what did it matter who had invented airplanes? It was rather more of a shock to him when he discovered, from some chance remark, that she did not remember that Oceania 4 years ago had been at war with East Asia. Had been at war with East Asia and at peace with Eurasia. It was true that she regarded the whole war as a sham, but apparently she had not even noticed that the name of the enemy had changed. I thought we'd always been at war with Eurasia, she said vaguely. It frightened him a little. The invention of airplanes dated from long before her birth, but the switchover in the war had happened only 4 years ago, well after she was grown up. He argued with her about it for perhaps a quarter of an hour. At the end, he succeeded in forcing her memory back until she did dimly recall that one time East Asia and not Eurasia had been the enemy, but the issue still struck her as unimportant. Who cares, she said impatiently. It's always one bloody war after another, and one knows the news is all lies anyways. Sometimes he talked to her of the records department and the impudent forgeries that he committed there. Such things did not appear to horrify her. She did not feel the abyss opening beneath her feet at the thoughts of lies becoming truths. He told her the story of Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, and the monumental slip of paper which he had once held between his fingers. It did not make much impression on her. At first, indeed, she failed to grasp the point of the story. Were they friends of yours? She said. No, I never knew them. They were inter-party members. Besides, they were far older men than I was. They belonged to the old days before the Revolution. I barely knew them by sight. Then what was there to worry about? People are being killed off all the time, aren't they? He tried to make her understand this was an exceptional case. It was just a question of somebody being killed. Do you realize the past starting from yesterday has been actually abolished? If it survives anywhere, it's in the few solid objects with no words attached to them, like the lump of glass there. Already we know almost literally nothing about the Revolution and the years before the Revolution. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book has been rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street and building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And that process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except the endless present, in which the party is always right. I know, of course, that the past is falsified, but it would never be possible for me to prove it, even when I did the falsification myself. After the thing is done, no evidence ever remains. The only evidence is inside my own mind, and I don't know with any certainty that any other human being shares my memories. Just in that one instance in my whole life, I did possess actual concrete evidence after the event, years after it. And what good was that? It was no good because I threw it away a few minutes later. But if the same thing happened today, I should keep it. Well, I wouldn't, said Julia. I'm quite ready to take risks, but only for something worthwhile, not for bits of old newspaper. What could you have done with it even if you had kept it? Not much, perhaps, but it was evidence. It might have planted a few doubts here and there, supposing that I'd dare to show it to anybody. I don't imagine that we can alter anything in our own lifetime, but one can imagine little knots of resistance springing up here and there. Small groups of people banding themselves together, and gradually growing, and even leaving a few records behind, so the next generation can carry on where we leave off. I'm not interested in the next generation, dear. I'm interested in us. You're only a rebel from the waist down, he told her. She thought this brilliant, witty, and flung her arms around him in delight. In the ramifications of party doctrine, she had not the faintest idea. In the ramifications of party doctrine, she had not the faintest interest. Whenever he began to talk of the principles of Ingsoc, doublethink, and mutability of the past, and the denial of objective reality, and to use newspeak words, she became bored and confused and said that she never paid any attention to that kind of thing. One knew that it was all rubbish, so why let oneself be worried by it? She knew when to cheer and when to boo, and that was all one needed. If he persisted in talking of such subjects, she had a disconcerting habit of falling asleep. She was one of those people who can go to sleep at any hour and in any position. Talking to her, he realized how easy it was to present an appearance of orthodoxy while having no grasp whatsoever on what orthodoxy meant. In a way, the worldview of the party imposed itself mostly successfully on people incapable of understanding it. They could be made to accept the most flagrant violations of reality because they never fully grasped the enormity of what was demanded of them, and were not sufficiently interested in public events to notice what was happening. By lack of understanding, they remained sane. They simply swallowed everything, and what they swallowed did them no harm, because it left no residue behind, just as a grain of corn will pass undigested through the body of a bird. We are to part 6. Make sure that's right. Yeah, just checking. It had happened at last. The expected message had come. All his life, it seemed to him, he had been waiting for this to happen. He was walking down the long corridor at the ministry, and he was almost at the spot where Julia had slipped the note into his hand, when he became aware that someone larger than himself was walking just behind him. The person, whoever it was, gave a small cough, evidently as a prelude of speaking. Winston stopped abruptly and turned. It was O'Brien. At last they were face to face, and it seemed that his only impulse was to run away. His heart bounded violently. He would have been incapable of speaking. O'Brien, however, had continued forward in the same movement, laying a friendly hand for a moment on Winston's arm, so that the two of them were walking side by side. He began speaking with a peculiar grave courtesy, and differentiated him from the majority of the inter-party members. "I'd been hoping for an opportunity of talking to you," he said. "I was reading one of your your Newspeak articles in the Times the other day. You take a scholarly interest in Newspeak, I believe." Winston had recovered part of his self-possession. "Hardly scholarly," he said. "I'm only an amateur. It's not my subject. I have never had anything to do with the actual construction of the language." But you write it very elegantly," said O'Brien. "That is not only my own opinion. I was talking recently to a friend of yours who is certainly an expert. His name has slipped my memory for the moment." Again, Winston's heart stirred painfully. It was inconceivable that this was anything other than a reference to Syme. But Syme was not only dead, he was abolished, and unperson, and an identifiable reference to him would have been mortally dangerous. O'Brien's remark must obviously have been intended as a signal, a code word. By sharing a small act of thought crime, he had turned the two of them into accomplices. They had continued to stroll slowly down the corridor, but now O'Brien halted, with the curious, disarming friendliness that he always managed to put into the gesture. He settled his spectacles on his nose, and then he went on. What I had really intended to say was that in your article I noticed that you used two words which have become obsolete, but they have only become so very recently. Have you seen the 10th edition of the Newspeak Dictionary? No, said Winston. I don't think it has been issued yet. We are still using the 9th in the records department. The 10th edition is not due to appear for some months, I believe, but a few advanced copies have been circulated. I have one myself. I might interest you to look at it, perhaps. Very much so, said Winston immediately, seeing where this tended. Some of the new developments are most ingenious. The reduction in the number of verbs, that is the point that will appeal to you, I think. Let me see. Shall I send a messenger to you with the dictionary? But I'm afraid I invariably forgot anything of the kind. Perhaps you could pick it up at my flat at some time that suited you. Wait. Let me get you my address. They were standing in front of a telescreen, somewhat absent-mindedly. O'Brien felt two of his pockets and then produced a small leather-covered notebook and a gold ink pencil. Immediately beneath the telescreen, in such a position that anyone who was watching at the other end of the instrument could read what he was writing, he scribbled an address, tore out the page, and handed it to Winston. "I'm usually at home in the evening," he said. "If not, my servant will give you the dictionary." He was gone, leaving Winston holding the scrap of paper, which this time there was no need to conceal. Nevertheless, he carefully memorized what was written on it, and some hours later dropped it into a memory hole along with a mass of other papers. They had been talking to one another for a couple of minutes at the most. There was only one meaning that the episode could possibly have. It had been contrived as a way of letting Winston know O'Brien's address. This was necessary because, except by direct inquiry, it was never possible to discover where anyone lived. There was no directories of any kind. "If you ever wanted to see me, this is where I can be found," was what O'Brien had been saying to him. Perhaps there would even be a message concealed somewhere in the dictionary. But at any rate, one thing was certain. The conspiracy that he had dreamed of did exist, and he had reached the outer edges of it. He knew that sooner or later he would obey O'Brien's summons. Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps after a long delay. He was not certain. What was happening was only the working out of a process that had started years ago. The first step had been a secret, involuntary thought. The second had been the opening of the diary. He had moved from thoughts to words, and now from words to actions. The last step was something that would happen in the ministry of love. He had accepted it. The end was contained in the beginning. but it was frightening, or more exactly, it was like a foretaste of death, like being a little less alive. Even while he was speaking to O'Brien, when the meaning of the words had sunk in, a chilly, shuddering feeling had taken possession of his body. He had a sensation of stepping into the dampness of a grave, and it was not much better, because he had always known that the grave was there and waiting for him. We're to part 7. Winston had woken up with his eyes full of tears. Julia rolled sleepily against him, murmuring something that might have been, "What's the matter?" "I dreamed," he began, and stopped shortly. It was too complex to put into words. There was the dream itself, and there was a memory connected with it that had swum into his mind in a few seconds after waking. He lay back with his eyes shut, still sodden in the atmosphere of the dream. It was a vast, luminous dream in which his whole life seemed to stretch out before him, like the landscape on a summer evening after rain. It had all occurred inside the glass paperweight, but the surface of the glass was the dome of the sky, and the inside of the dome everything was flooded with clear, soft light in which no one could see into interminable distances. The dream had also been comprehended by, indeed, in some sense it had consisted in, a gesture of the arm made by his mother, and made again 30 years later by the Jewish woman he had seen on the news film trying to shelter the small boy from the bullets before the helicopters blew them both to pieces. "Do you know," he said, "that until this moment I believed I had murdered my mother?" Why did you murder her?" said Julia, almost asleep. "I didn't murder her, not physically. In the dream he had remembered his last glimpses of his mother, and within a few moments of waking, the cluster of small events surrounding it had all come back. It was a memory that he must have deliberately pushed out of his consciousness over many years. He was not certain of the date, but it could not have been less than 10 years old, possibly 12, when it had happened. His father had disappeared some time earlier. How much earlier he could not remember. He remembered better the racketry, uneasy circumstances of the time, the periodical panics about air raids and the sheltering in the tube stations, the piles of rubble everywhere, the unintelligible proclamations posted at street corners, the gangs of youths in shirts all the same color, the enormous queues outside the bakeries, the intermittent machine gun fire in the distance. Above all, the fact that there was never enough to eat. He remembered the long afternoons spent with other boys in scrounging around dust bins and rubbish heaps, picking out the ribs of cabbage leaves, potato peels, sometimes even scraps of stale breadcrumbs, from which he carefully scraped away the cinders, and also in waiting for the passing of trucks which traveled over a certain route, and which were known to carry cattle feed, and which, when they jolted over the bad patches of road, sometimes spilled a few fragments of oil cake. We're going to have to stop that here, but we make it page 133. We have been reading from George Orwell's 1984. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. And if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.